From the moment Pope Leo set foot on American soil, the world changed. In a fiery confrontation that stunned millions, the Vatican's leader unleashed a thunderous rebuke against Donald Trump right at the heart of the United States. This isn't just a clash of words, it's a seismic shift in the balance of power, a moment that will echo through history. What happened next left both supporters and critics speechless as the Pope's actions sent shockwaves across the nation. Stay with us, because what you're about to witness could redefine everything you thought you knew about leadership, faith, and justice. Subscribe now and tell us what you think your voice matters in this historic moment. The air in Washington, D.C. was thick with anticipation. News had broken just hours before Pope Leo, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, was arriving in the United States for an unscheduled visit. The timing was extraordinary, coming in the midst of a heated national debate over immigration, social justice, and the role of faith in politics. The White House, already on edge from weeks of public scrutiny, scrambled to prepare for the arrival of the pontiff. Security details were doubled, streets were cordoned off. Reporters from every major network lined the avenues, their cameras trained on the tarmac where the papal plane would soon touch down. As the aircraft doors opened, a hush fell over the crowd. Pope Leo emerged, his expression solemn, his eyes scanning the sea of faces before him. He was not a man easily rattled by the spectacle of politics, nor was he a stranger to controversy. His tenure as Pope had already been marked by bold statements and sweeping reforms. But today, there was a different energy in the air, a sense that something historic was about to unfold. The President Donald Trump stood at the edge of the red carpet, flanked by advisors and Secret Service agents. His posture was rigid, his face set in a practiced smile. He extended his hand as Pope Leo approached. The two men exchanged brief pleasantries for the cameras, but anyone watching closely could see the tension simmering beneath the surface. This was not a meeting of allies, it was a collision of two powerful worlds, each with its own vision for the future. Inside the White House, the meeting began with the usual formalities. Photographers snapped pictures as the Pope and the President sat side by side, their expressions carefully neutral. But as soon as the doors closed and the room emptied of all but the most trusted aides, the atmosphere shifted. Pope Leo leaned forward, his voice low but unwavering. "Mr. President," he began, "the world is watching. The decisions made in this room will echo far beyond these walls. I come not as a politician but as a shepherd of souls, and I must speak plainly." Trump bristled, unused to being addressed in such a manner. He glanced at his advisors, searching for a sign of reassurance, but found none. The Pope continued, his words measured and deliberate. "In recent months, your administration has enacted policies that have caused great suffering," Pope Leo said. "Families have been separated. The poor and the vulnerable have been pushed aside. The teachings of Christ compel us to protect the least among us, not to turn them away." Trump interrupted, his tone defensive. "With all due respect, Your Holiness, my job is to protect the American people. We have laws, we have borders, the world is a dangerous place." Pope Leo did not flinch. "Compassion is not weakness. Justice is not a threat. When leaders use fear to divide, they betray the very principles upon which their nations were founded." The exchange grew more intense. The President, accustomed to dominating every conversation, found himself on the defensive. The Pope, undeterred, pressed on. "History will judge us not by the strength of our armies or the size of our economies, but by how we treat the most vulnerable. You have the power to heal or to harm. Choose wisely." The meeting ended abruptly. The President rose, his face flushed with anger. The Pope stood as well, his gaze unwavering. There was no handshake this time, no polite farewell. The two men parted in silence, each carrying the weight of the encounter. Outside, the world waited. Rumors of the confrontation spread quickly. News outlets scrambled to confirm details, analysts speculated on the implications. The Vatican released a brief statement reaffirming the Pope's commitment to justice and mercy. The White House issued a terse response, insisting that the President remained focused on the needs of the American people. But the story was far from over. That evening, Pope Leo addressed a gathering at the National Cathedral. The pews were filled with politicians, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens. Cameras broadcast his words to millions around the globe. He spoke of unity, of the moral responsibility of leaders, of the dangers of fear and division. He called on Americans to remember their shared humanity, to reject hatred, and to embrace compassion. His words resonated far beyond the walls of the cathedral, sparking conversations in homes, schools, and places of worship across the country. The next morning, headlines blared, "Pope Leo confronts Trump. Vatican challenges White House. A new era of moral leadership." The president, never one to back down from a fight, took to social media, defending his record and dismissing the Pope's remarks as out of touch with reality. But the impact of the encounter could not be denied. Across the nation, people debated the meaning of leadership, the role of faith in public life, and the responsibilities of those in power. Some praised the Pope for his courage, others accused him of meddling in American affairs. The debate was fierce, but one thing was clear: the world had witnessed something unprecedented. In the days that followed, the Vatican announced a series of new initiatives aimed at supporting refugees and promoting social justice. Catholic charities across the United States mobilized launching campaigns to aid families affected by recent policies. The Pope's message had ignited a movement inspiring people of all faiths to take action. Meanwhile, the White House faced mounting pressure. Lawmakers from both parties called for a re-evaluation of immigration policies. Faith leaders organized marches and vigils. The administration, caught off guard by the intensity of the response, struggled to regain control of the narrative. As the nation grappled with the fallout, Pope Leo continued his tour, meeting with community leaders, visiting shelters, and offering prayers for the country. His presence was a reminder that moral authority could not be silenced by political power. The confrontation between Pope Leo and President Trump had set off a chain reaction, one that would shape the future of the country and the world for years to come. The days following the confrontation saw the United States gripped by a rare sense of uncertainty. In cities and small towns alike, people gathered in churches, coffee shops, and public squares to discuss what had transpired between Pope Leo and President Trump. The Pope's words echoed in the minds of millions, stirring both admiration and outrage. For some, his visit was a beacon of hope, a sign that moral courage could still challenge political might. For others, it was an unwelcome intrusion, a challenge to national sovereignty and the right of a country to chart its own course. Cable news channels ran endless loops of the Pope's address at the National Cathedral, dissecting every phrase and gesture. Pundits debated whether his intervention would have any lasting impact or fade into the background noise of a divided nation. Yet beneath the surface, something fundamental was shifting. Religious leaders from across denominations issued statements of support, urging their congregations to reflect on the Pope's call for compassion and justice. Synagogues, mosques, and temples joined in organizing interfaith dialogues and community outreach programs. The sense of unity was fragile, but it was real. In the corridors of power, the mood was far less harmonious. Senior advisors convened in the West Wing, poring over polling data and drafting responses. The president's inner circle was divided. Some urged a hardline approach, arguing that any concession would be seen as weakness. Others saw an opportunity to reach out to faith-based voters to frame the administration's policies as compatible with religious values. Trump himself was unyielding. He unleashed a series of tweets denouncing the Vatican's meddling and reaffirming his commitment to America first. The tweets went viral, sparking a new wave of debate and drawing sharp rebukes from Catholic leaders. Meanwhile, Pope Leo continued his journey across the country. In Chicago, he visited a shelter for immigrant families, listening to stories of hardship and resilience. He knelt in prayer with mothers who had been separated from their children, offering words of comfort and hope. The images were broadcast around the world, a stark contrast to the heated rhetoric emanating from Washington. In Los Angeles, he met with young activists fighting for social justice, encouraging them to persevere in the face of adversity. His message was consistent: true leadership requires empathy, humility, and a willingness to serve. The Vatican's initiatives gained momentum. Catholic charities reported record donations, enabling them to expand their services to those most in need. Volunteers flooded food banks and legal aid clinics, inspired by the Pope's example. The movement transcended religious boundaries, drawing in people of all backgrounds who shared a commitment to justice and compassion. Stories of transformation began to emerge. Families reunited, children returned to school, communities rebuilt through collective action. As the Pope's visit drew to a close, he delivered one final address on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The crowd stretched as far as the eye could see, a tapestry of faces united by a common purpose. Pope Leo spoke with clarity and conviction, his voice carrying across the reflecting pool. He reminded the nation of its founding ideals, of the promise inscribed on the Statue of Liberty, and of the responsibility to uphold those values in times of trial. His words were not a condemnation, but a call to conscience, a challenge to rise above division and fear. In the aftermath, the White House announced a review of certain policies, citing the need for national healing. The move was met with skepticism by some, but others saw it as a sign that change was possible. Across the country, the conversation shifted. People began to ask not just what their leaders could do, but what they themselves could contribute to the common good. The legacy of Pope Leo's visit was still unfolding. For many, it marked a turning point, a moment when the power of moral conviction stood toe-to-toe with the machinery of politics. The debate would continue, but the seeds of transformation had been planted, and their impact would be felt for generations to come. As the days passed, the ripple effects of Pope Leo's visit continued to spread through American society. In the halls of Congress, lawmakers found themselves under increasing pressure from constituents moved by the Pope's message. Town hall meetings grew more tense and impassioned, with citizens demanding answers about family separations, refugee support, and the nation's moral obligations. Some representatives, sensing a shift in public sentiment, began to break ranks with party leadership, calling for bipartisan solutions to the crises at hand. Media coverage intensified, with every major outlet dedicating prime-time segments to the aftermath of the Vatican's unprecedented intervention. Editorials debated the appropriate boundaries between church and state, but few could deny the surge of civic engagement Pope Leo had inspired. The phrase "moral leadership" trended across social platforms as people shared stories of grassroots activism and community solidarity. Even critics of the Pope's approach acknowledged the renewed focus on compassion and justice in public discourse. Inside the Vatican Embassy in Washington, Pope Leo met privately with a coalition of faith leaders from across the religious spectrum. They discussed strategies for sustaining the momentum of his visit, emphasizing the need for unity in the face of political polarization. The Pope listened intently, his demeanor calm but resolute. He encouraged his counterparts to act not out of fear or anger, but from a place of hope and conviction. The meeting concluded with a joint statement urging Americans to reject division and work together for the common good. Meanwhile, President Trump convened his own advisors, determined to reassert control over the narrative. He authorized a series of high-profile appearances, seeking to rally his base and deflect criticism. At campaign-style rallies, he doubled down on his policies, framing them as essential to national security and prosperity. Supporters cheered, but outside the venues, protesters gathered in growing numbers, holding signs that quoted the Pope's call for compassion. The tension between the two visions for America became a defining feature of the national conversation. In schools and universities, students organized debates and forums, eager to grapple with the ethical questions raised by the confrontation. Teachers assigned essays on the role of conscience in leadership, while parents discussed the events with their children at dinner tables across the country. As the Pope prepared to depart, he issued a final message to the American people. He expressed gratitude for the hospitality he had received, but reminded the nation that true greatness was measured not by wealth or power, but by the willingness to care for the least among its citizens. His words were broadcast live, reaching millions who paused to listen, if only for a moment. At the airport, a diverse crowd gathered to bid farewell. Some wept openly, others stood in silent reflection. Pope Leo moved among them, offering blessings and words of encouragement. As his plane lifted off, many sensed that a chapter in American history had closed and a new one was beginning. The debate Pope Leo had ignited would not be easily resolved. But in the weeks and months that followed, his challenge to the nation's conscience continued to echo, shaping decisions in boardrooms, classrooms, and homes. For some, it was a call to action, for others a reminder of the enduring power of faith to confront even the most entrenched systems of power. In the weeks after Pope Leo's departure, the American landscape was transformed by a wave of grassroots activism. Inspired by the Pope's words, local communities organized food drives, legal aid clinics, and support groups for families affected by recent policies. Churches opened their doors to the homeless and undocumented, while synagogues and mosques joined in interfaith efforts to provide shelter and hope. The media began to highlight these stories of solidarity, shifting the national conversation from division to compassion. Political leaders, sensing the changing mood, convened emergency sessions to address the mounting public pressure. Some governors announced executive orders to protect vulnerable populations, defying federal directives. Mayors in major cities declared their commitment to sanctuary policies, vowing to stand with those in need, regardless of their immigration status. The country's patchwork of responses reflected both the complexity of the issues and the strength of local resolve. Within the White House, the mood was tense. Advisors debated how to respond to the growing movement. Some argued for a hardline stance, warning that any sign of weakness would embolden critics. Others, however, recognized the risk of further alienating moderate voters and faith communities. President Trump, watching the nightly news coverage, grew increasingly frustrated by the persistent focus on the Pope's message. He convened a special task force to craft a new communications strategy, hoping to regain control of the narrative. Meanwhile, the Vatican's influence continued to grow. Catholic charities reported unprecedented levels of volunteerism and donations. Religious leaders from other denominations reached out to the Vatican, seeking guidance on how to sustain the momentum. Pope Leo, back in Rome, held a series of global broadcasts, urging people everywhere to stand up for justice and mercy. His words resonated far beyond the United States, sparking similar movements in Europe, Latin America, and Africa. Academics and historians began to analyze the confrontation, drawing parallels to other moments in history when moral authority had challenged political power. Editorials appeared in major newspapers debating whether Pope Leo's intervention marked a new era for the relationship between faith and government. Some praised his courage, while others cautioned against the dangers of religious leaders wielding too much influence in secular affairs. Despite the debates, the impact on ordinary Americans was undeniable. In schools, students organized service projects and wrote letters to lawmakers demanding humane policies. In workplaces, employees pooled resources to support colleagues facing hardship. Across the country, a sense of shared responsibility began to take root, cutting across traditional lines of division. The administration, under mounting pressure, announced a review of its most controversial policies. Congressional hearings were scheduled with testimony from faith leaders, legal experts, and those directly affected by the changes. The hearings were broadcast live, drawing millions of viewers. The stories shared were powerful and often heartbreaking, forcing lawmakers to confront the real-life consequences of their decisions. As the nation grappled with these challenges, Pope Leo's legacy grew. His visit had not only sparked a political crisis, but had also awakened a dormant sense of empathy and civic duty. People who had never before been involved in activism found themselves marching in the streets, volunteering at shelters, and speaking out at town hall meetings. The Pope's call for compassion had become a rallying cry for a new generation of leaders. In the midst of this transformation, the president faced a choice. He could continue to resist the movement, risking further isolation and unrest, or he could seek common ground and embrace the spirit of reconciliation. The decision would have far-reaching consequences, shaping the future of the country and its place in the world. As winter approached, the nation stood at a crossroads. The memory of Pope Leo's visit lingered in the air, a reminder that even in the face of great division, the power of conscience could inspire change. The story was far from over, and the world watched closely to see what America would do next. The onset of winter brought a heightened sense of urgency to the national debate. As temperatures dropped, the plight of those most affected by recent policies became even more visible. Shelters in major cities reported record numbers of families seeking warmth and safety. Volunteers, galvanized by Pope Leo's call to action, braved the cold to distribute food blankets and medical supplies. News outlets carried images of these efforts, contrasting them with the heated rhetoric still emanating from political leaders in Washington. In Congress, the scheduled hearings became a focal point for the nation's conscience. Testimonies from faith leaders, social workers, and ordinary citizens painted a vivid picture of hardship and resilience. A mother described her struggle to reunite with her children after being separated at the border. A pastor recounted the fear and uncertainty gripping his congregation. Legal experts outlined the long-term consequences of harsh immigration measures, while community organizers shared stories of hope and recovery. The hearings were emotional and at times contentious, but they forced lawmakers to confront the human cost of their decisions. The president, watching the proceedings from the Oval Office, weighed his options. His advisors continued to push conflicting strategies. Some urged him to double down, to frame the movement as a threat to national security and traditional values. Others saw an opportunity to pivot, to acknowledge the concerns raised by the Pope and the public, and to champion a message of unity. The political stakes were high, but so too was the potential for lasting change. Meanwhile, Pope Leo's influence remained strong. From Rome, he issued a series of statements and interviews, reiterating his commitment to justice and mercy. He praised the American people for their compassion and resilience, urging them not to lose hope. His words found receptive audiences far beyond the Catholic community, inspiring activists, educators, and ordinary citizens to continue their efforts. Across the country, the movement showed no signs of slowing. Interfaith coalitions organized vigils and marches demanding humane treatment for immigrants and refugees. Universities hosted forums on moral leadership and civic responsibility. Social media campaigns amplified personal stories connecting people from diverse backgrounds in a shared pursuit of justice. The spirit of solidarity transcended religious and political boundaries, forging new alliances and strengthening existing ones. In the White House, the president convened a rare meeting with leaders from various faith traditions. The discussion was candid and at times tense. Religious leaders pressed for immediate action to address the humanitarian crisis, while administration officials outlined the challenges of balancing security and compassion. The president listened intently, aware that his next steps would be scrutinized by a nation and a world eager for resolution. As the meeting concluded, a sense of possibility lingered in the air. For the first time in months, there was talk of compromise and collaboration. Lawmakers from both parties began drafting bipartisan proposals aimed at reforming immigration policies and expanding support for vulnerable populations. The path forward was uncertain, but the momentum for change was undeniable. In neighborhoods across America, the impact of these developments was felt in tangible ways. Families were reunited, children returned to school. Communities once divided by fear and suspicion found common ground in shared acts of kindness. The Pope's message, delivered in a moment of crisis, had become a catalyst for renewal and hope. The nation, still grappling with deep divisions, stood on the threshold of transformation. The choices made in the coming weeks would determine not only the fate of millions, but also the character of the country itself. As snow fell gently on the nation's capital, the world watched and waited, hopeful that the lessons of compassion and justice would endure. The momentum for change continued to build as the new year approached. Across the United States, the effects of the Pope's message were visible in both policy and daily life. Local governments, emboldened by the surge of civic engagement, launched new initiatives to support immigrants, the homeless, and families in crisis. Community centers became hubs of activity, offering language classes, job training, and legal assistance. The sense of shared purpose that had taken root in the aftermath of Pope Leo's visit showed no signs of fading. In Washington, the bipartisan proposals crafted in the wake of the faith leaders' meeting began to take shape. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle worked late into the night, negotiating the details of a sweeping reform package. The legislation aimed to address not only immigration, but also healthcare, education, and economic opportunity for marginalized groups. The process was contentious, with fierce debates and moments of doubt, but the desire for a meaningful resolution kept the talks alive. President Trump, aware of the stakes, adopted a more measured tone in his public statements. He acknowledged the challenges faced by vulnerable communities and expressed a willingness to consider new approaches. While some of his core supporters voiced concern over this apparent shift, others welcomed the prospect of healing a fractured nation. The president's advisors monitored public opinion closely, noting a gradual increase in approval ratings as the administration signaled openness to compromise. Meanwhile, Pope Leo's influence remained a constant presence. His addresses from the Vatican were broadcast regularly on American television, where they were met with both admiration and criticism. He continued to emphasize the importance of empathy, justice, and moral leadership, urging Americans to remain steadfast in their commitment to one another. His words resonated with those who had felt marginalized or ignored, giving voice to their hopes and fears. The media chronicled the unfolding story with relentless attention. Investigative reports highlighted the progress made in communities across the country, while editorial boards debated the long-term implications of the Pope's intervention. Commentators noted a shift in the national mood, describing a cautious optimism that had replaced the bitterness of previous months. The phrase Pope Leo effect began to appear in headlines, shorthand for the wave of compassion and activism sweeping the nation. In schools and universities, students studied the events as a case study in civic engagement and moral courage. Professors encouraged their classes to analyze the intersection of faith and politics, challenging them to consider the responsibilities of leadership in a divided society. Young people, inspired by the example set by the Pope and the movement he sparked, organized voter registration drives and community service projects. As winter gave way to spring, the reform package passed its first major hurdle in Congress. Lawmakers celebrated the achievement but cautioned that much work remained to be done. Advocacy groups continued to press for further changes, determined to keep the momentum alive. The White House announced plans for a national day of service, inviting citizens of all backgrounds to participate in acts of kindness and solidarity. The legacy of Pope Leo's visit was now firmly embedded in the American consciousness. His challenge to the nation's conscience had not only sparked a political reckoning, but had also inspired a renewed sense of hope and possibility. The country, while still divided in many ways, had discovered new avenues for dialogue and cooperation. As the cherry blossoms bloomed in the nation's capital, the world watched as America took its first tentative steps toward reconciliation. The choices made in the coming months would determine whether the lessons of compassion and justice would endure, shaping the nation's identity for generations to come. Spring brought a renewed energy to the nation's capital. The city, once paralyzed by gridlock and distrust, now buzzed with cautious optimism. The bipartisan reform package, though still facing hurdles, had sparked a new era of cooperation in Congress. Lawmakers who had once refused to speak to each other now found themselves working late into the night, hammering out compromises and searching for common ground. The spirit of service and solidarity that Pope Leo had ignited was now a tangible force, shaping the decisions of those in power. Across the country, the effects of this new spirit were unmistakable. In cities and rural towns alike, neighbors reached across divides, volunteering together at food banks and community centers. Houses of worship, once wary of political involvement, became centers of civic engagement, hosting town halls and voter education drives. The stories of families reunited and lives transformed became regular features in the evening news, a testament to the power of collective action. Pope Leo, observing these developments from Rome, continued to offer guidance and encouragement. His messages broadcast around the world emphasized the importance of perseverance and humility. He reminded Americans that true change was never easy and that setbacks were inevitable. But he also celebrated the progress made, praising the courage of those who had chosen compassion over fear. The president, sensing the shifting winds, took steps to further bridge the gap between his administration and the movement inspired by the Pope. He invited a delegation of faith leaders and community organizers to the White House for a roundtable discussion. The meeting, broadcast live, was a symbolic gesture of unity and a signal to the nation that dialogue was possible even in times of deep disagreement. At the roundtable, participants spoke candidly about their hopes and concerns. A young activist described her journey from despair to activism, crediting Pope Leo's words for giving her the courage to speak out. A pastor recounted the transformation within his congregation as members set aside old grievances to serve their neighbors. The president listened, occasionally asking questions, and pledged to continue working towards solutions that honored the dignity of every person. The media, ever watchful, reported on these developments with a mix of skepticism and hope. Some commentators questioned whether the changes would last or if they were merely temporary responses to public pressure. Others argued that the nation was witnessing the birth of a new kind of politics, one rooted in empathy and shared responsibility. Meanwhile, the reform package advanced through Congress, clearing committee after committee. Advocacy groups remained vigilant, organizing rallies and letter-writing campaigns to ensure that the final legislation reflected the needs of the most vulnerable. The debates were fierce, but the tone had shifted. Lawmakers spoke less about party loyalty and more about the common good, invoking the language of moral responsibility that Pope Leo had brought to the forefront. In homes across America, families discussed the unfolding events around their dinner tables. Parents explained to their children the significance of compassion and the importance of standing up for what was right. Teachers incorporated lessons on civic engagement and ethical leadership into their curricula, encouraging students to see themselves as agents of change. As spring turned to summer, the nation braced for the final votes on the reform package. The stakes were high and the outcome uncertain. But whatever the result, it was clear that Pope Leo's visit had left an indelible mark on the American soul. The country had been challenged to look beyond its divisions, to embrace its highest ideals, and to remember that the true measure of greatness lay in how it treated the least among its people. As the summer sun rose higher, anticipation reached its peak in Washington. The reform package, now known as the Compassion Act, stood on the brink of a historic vote. The city was alive with rallies, prayer vigils, and marches. Faith leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens converged on the Capitol, their voices rising in a chorus that echoed the Pope's call for justice and mercy. The air was thick with hope and anxiety as the nation waited to see if its leaders would rise to the moment. Inside Congress, the atmosphere was tense but resolute. Lawmakers from both parties, having spent months negotiating and refining the bill, prepared for the decisive session. The Compassion Act had become more than just legislation. It was a symbol of the nation's willingness to confront its conscience and act on its values. The debates were passionate but respectful, a stark contrast to the acrimony of previous years. Representatives spoke of their constituents' struggles, of the moral imperative to protect the vulnerable, and of the opportunity to heal a divided country. The president, aware of the bill's significance, addressed the nation from the Oval Office on the eve of the vote. His speech was measured, invoking the themes of unity and renewal. He acknowledged the pain and anger that had divided the country, but he also spoke of the hope that had emerged from those divisions. He thanked the faith leaders and activists who had kept the issue alive, and he pledged to sign the Compassion Act if it reached his desk. The address was broadcast nationwide, watched by millions who sensed that history was in the making. The day of the vote dawned clear and bright. Crowds gathered outside the Capitol, many holding signs that quoted Pope Leo's words. Inside, the chamber was packed. The roll call began, each name met with cheers or anxious silence. As the final votes were tallied, it became clear that the bill had passed by a narrow but decisive margin. The chamber erupted in applause. Outside, the news spread like wildfire across the city, across the country, and around the world. The passage of the Compassion Act marked a turning point. The legislation provided pathways to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, expanded support for refugees, and increased funding for social services in underserved communities. It also included provisions for family reunification and protections for children. The impact was immediate. Families were reunited, deportations slowed, and resources flowed to communities in need. The sense of relief and celebration was palpable. Pope Leo, watching from Rome, issued a statement praising the courage and compassion of the American people. He reminded them that the work of justice was never finished, and that each generation was called to renew its commitment to the common good. His words were read at churches, mosques, and synagogues across the country, reinforcing the sense of shared purpose that had brought the nation to this moment. The media captured the jubilation and the stories of those whose lives had been changed by the new law. A father, once separated from his children, embraced them at an airport reunion. a young woman brought to the US as a child, spoke of her dreams for the future as she received her residency papers. Community leaders described the outpouring of support and the renewed sense of hope that swept through neighborhoods. Yet even in the midst of celebration, there were reminders of the work still to be done. Critics warned of challenges ahead, legal battles, bureaucratic delays, and the need for continued vigilance to ensure the law's fair implementation. Faith leaders and activists pledged to remain engaged, determined to hold policymakers accountable and to defend the gains that had been made. In classrooms, students studied the events as a living lesson in democracy and moral courage. Teachers encouraged them to think critically about the responsibilities of citizenship and the power of collective action. The story of Pope Leo's confrontation with President Trump became a touchstone, a reminder that even the most entrenched systems could be changed by the force of conscience and the courage of ordinary people. As summer faded into autumn, the nation began to reflect on the journey it had taken. The divisions that had once seemed insurmountable had not disappeared, but they had been challenged by a new spirit of empathy and resolve. The Compassion Act stood as a testament to what was possible when leaders listened to the voices of the people and acted with moral clarity. As autumn settled over the nation, the effects of the Compassion Act began to ripple through every layer of American society. The initial wave of reunified families and newly protected individuals brought a sense of relief and gratitude, but also a new set of challenges. Local agencies, faith-based organizations, and volunteers worked tirelessly to help newcomers navigate the complex systems of healthcare, education, and employment. The spirit of service that had swept the country in the wake of Pope Leo's visit was now being tested in practice. In city halls and state legislatures, leaders debated how best to implement the new policies. Some states moved quickly, expanding social services and launching public awareness campaigns to inform residents of their rights and opportunities. Others, more resistant to change, saw protests and legal challenges. The national conversation, while still marked by disagreement, was now grounded in the shared reality of the Compassion Act's impact. Pope Leo's influence remained visible. His image adorned murals in immigrant neighborhoods, and his words were quoted in sermons and speeches. Faith leaders continued to organize interfaith coalitions, focusing not just on advocacy, but on building lasting relationships across religious and cultural divides. The Pope's message that moral leadership required both courage and humility became a guiding principle for many. The White House, meanwhile, worked to maintain the fragile coalition that had made the Compassion Act possible. The president convened regular meetings with community leaders seeking feedback and promising to address any shortcomings in the law's implementation. His administration launched a series of public forums inviting citizens to share their experiences and concerns. The tone of these gatherings was often emotional but constructive, reflecting a new willingness to listen and adapt. Media outlets chronicled the ongoing transformation. Investigative journalists followed families as they rebuilt their lives, highlighting both the successes and the setbacks. Editorials praised the nation's renewed commitment to justice, while also warning against complacency. The story of the Compassion Act was now deeply intertwined with the story of America itself, a nation striving, sometimes stumbling, but always reaching for its highest ideals. In schools, students organized service projects and cultural festivals to welcome new classmates. Teachers assigned essays on the meaning of citizenship and the responsibilities of living in a diverse democracy. The events of the past year became a living curriculum, shaping the next generation's understanding of leadership, justice, and the power of collective action. As Thanksgiving approached, communities across the country gathered to celebrate in new and inclusive ways. Tables were set for families old and new, with dishes from every corner of the world. Prayers and blessings were offered in many languages, reflecting the rich tapestry of American life. The sense of gratitude was profound, not just for the material abundance, but for the hard-won progress and the hope that now filled the air. Yet, challenges remained. The process of integrating new residents was not without friction, and some communities struggled to adapt. Economic pressures and political divisions continued to test the nation's resolve. But the memory of Pope Leo's visit and the movement it had inspired served as a reminder that change was possible even in the face of great adversity. In Rome, Pope Leo watched these developments with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He continued to speak out on issues of justice and mercy, encouraging other nations to follow America's example. His message was clear: the work of building a more compassionate world was never finished, and every generation had a role to play. As winter approached once more, the United States stood transformed. The Compassion Act had not solved every problem, but it had opened a new chapter in the nation's history. The world watched, taking note of the lessons learned and the challenges ahead, as America moved forward, guided by the enduring power of conscience, the strength of community, and the hope that had been rekindled by a single unprecedented act of moral leadership.